Hello and welcome. My name is Olivia Hupp, and on behalf of Youth Time International Movement, thanks for joining us. If you've missed any of our previous videos or content, not to worry. They're all on our YouTube channel under playlists, and while you're there, don't forget to subscribe so you can keep up with all of our future content. Our interview today is with Dr. Victoria Rubin. She's an active researcher and lecturer out of the University of Western Ontario, as well as director of the Languages and Information Technology Research Lab. She's currently in the process of writing her book, Misinformation and Disinformation, Detecting Fakes with the Eye and AI. Our interview today will be about the psychology of mis and disinformation, or really, why we believe fake news. So on that note, let's get started. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our expert speaker, Dr. Victoria Rubin, who's here with us today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, but I don't see my video. Here we go.
Perfect.
You can probably see me now.
There we go. All right. So I want to thank you very much
Hi.
for joining us. And if you could give everyone a brief overview.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you so much. Yes. Hi. Thank you for having me. So I work at the University of Western Ontario and basically teach in library information science programs for graduate students, those students who would like to be librarians. My area of expertise is called natural language processing, which is, in simple words, use of computers to analyze language. So it all starts from the love of languages. I'm a multilingual speaker, and I've had interest in how people express emotions, how people communicate their message, their goals. And I've had an interest in how particular subtleties of our communications could be expressed in language. So the goal of the lab in big terms is to find these subtle patterns that can show some phenomena that are partly behavioral, partly psychological, for example, emotions or uncertainty, and in the last 10 years or so, deception. And by that, I mean lying or various kinds of falsifications, equivocations, and so forth.
Absolutely, which kind of leads us into our topic of today, which is the psychology of mis and disinformation. So yes. Could you give us a definition or the differences between mis and disinformation, excuse me?
Sure. So it, of course, depends on who you ask. So in 2019, there was a report to the legislative branch of US Congress that was put together by Library of Congress law specialists and analysts. They simply put it as false information deliberately and often covertly spread in order to influence public opinion and obscure the truth. That really doesn't tell us much because it basically says disinformation is falsehoods, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at some of the research that comes from the psychology, and that's why the topic of this conversation is psychology of mis and disinformation, receiving for over 50 years, so 70 years in the experimental interpersonal psychology and communication. And what they call it, they call deception a message that is knowingly and intentionally transmitted so that somebody else to whom you're communicating would have a false impression in their mind. And that idea of intentionality is what distinguishes mis and disinformation. So disinformation is then intentionally inaccurate or deceptive or misleading content that is widely disseminated, while misinformation lacks that deceptive intent. It might have been spread by chance, people not realizing that something is inaccurate or misleading. So it's not a deliberate lie, it's just facilitating its spread through various channels.
I see. Okay. So is it possible then? Sense? Yes, it does. It makes a lot of sense. Is it possible then for disinformation to become misinformation if it's shared maybe on social media or through friends or however media is spread nowadays?
Yes, exactly. So that's how it happens, is that in case of misinformation, people try to be helpful. They often um, try to spread the word to warn others. And if they haven't really clued in or been misled themselves, they basically pass it on to others in their best intentions quite
Mm.
often. So while the actual originators and creators of disinformation keep that in mind, knowing some of the human biases and tendencies, and often exploit it, facilitating that machinery of spread of disinformation.
I see. Okay. So in recent years, the term fake news has been circulating a lot, and it's very politically charged, I would say. Where would fake news or the idea of fake news fall in this kind of spectrum between misinformation and disinformation?
So it's interesting that you asked this question. I think in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, scholars that study fake news have distanced themselves from that term,
Mm.
partly because of its popularization starting around 2016 U.S. presidential election,
Mhm.
when the term was very quickly weaponized and basically irredeemably polarized, co-opted by politicians, and refer to any information put out by sources that do not support their partisan position. Particularly right-wing US politicians and commentators used it to castigate left-wing reporting and critical news organizations. But it was used before 2016. We have used it to refer to satirical news, which was more or less fake news used to mean something along the line of Oliver Colbert Report, or The Onion, or the Harvard Lampoon. And at this point, people that study mis and disinformation use different terms, and it's important to keep in mind sort of the goals where I'm coming at this phenomena. My idea that I explained to you earlier, the use of computers, is to basically be able to provide a system that would be able to distinguish truthful, legitimate reporting
Mhm.
versus various types of various fakes of mis and disinformation. So we started from providing very concrete example of falsehoods, journalistic fraud as early as 2013, 2014, 15.
Mhm.
We went into different types of fakes, satirical fakes, and we've started working on clickbait. And that's been our classification of three types that are more concrete. We called it at sometimes three types of fake news,
Mhm.
because that's prior to politicization of the term. But nowadays, people, for example, at Penn State University, people distinguish even 7 types, like false news, polarized content, misreporting, commentary, even persuasive information, and citizen journalism, which is not basically, the idea is that it wouldn't be coming from legacy journalism outlets, but rather from bloggers, TikTokers, Tweeters, and so forth. Some people throw in propaganda, which is important to point out. For instance, Data and Society Research Institute out of New York City places an emphasis on systematic persuasion campaigns, be it
Mhm.
commercial or for the purposes of promoting somebody's persona, political agenda.
Mhm.
And so sometimes they call it problematic information. And there's one more category that kind of competes with that idea of fake news nowadays. And people actually in Europe that have worked on the European Commission for the problem of fake news have called it malinformation. And in that case, malinformation means genuine information that has been shared in order to cause harm or create chaos. And that we have seen that referred to the term trolling.
Mhm.
So as of 2021, the terms mis and disinformation persist as near equivalents, with that tiny subtlety of deceptive intent or unintentional spread through the social media. And of course, many social media companies and users are working towards being able to provide these systematic ways of identifying and labeling and
Mhm.
warning users of potential harms that this information can cause.
So it's very important work that's happening, and I think as social media and media becomes more prevalent everywhere, I think misinformation and disinformation are also becoming much more prevalent nowadays. Do you? So it sounds like the current ways of spotting fake news, if you will, are very academic or very high level for someone that's already operating in the field. Do you have any tips or tricks perhaps of us on the ground level who just use social media or read the news on a daily basis to kind of spot fake news, or how to see it in everyday life?
I wouldn't agree that it's academic. I think given the use of social media
Mm-hmm.
nowadays and the preference of most adults, in the polls that have been done, at least 2/3 of adults go to social media for their news. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a very everyday kind of decision. And in terms of solutions, some of them intuitive and simple. So it comes down to a very simple approach: stop and think.
Mm.
And think a little bit before you reshare. Some people call it think before you click. There are many versions of that approach to slow down the spread of misinformation. Twitter has tried to put reminders to people to not reshare before you actually check out what the content is all about. So along those lines, but sometimes it's hard to implement, and it helps to have some kind of a reminder. So as of 2016-17, there have been campaigns for what we call news literacy or information literacy or even media literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And some organizations have come up with iconographics. If you could bring up that slide that I shared with you earlier,
Mm-hmm.
Olivia, there's one that I find particularly helpful, the one
Absolutely.
by the International Federation of Library Association, IFLA.
Uh-huh.
It was put out quite early in 2016, and
And
it catches your eye. I don't know if you can show that.
is it this
Here we
one?
go. So there are yes, please. So these are various versions of materials that have been forwarded by different organizations, including IFLA, International Federation of Library Associations Information, in their collaboration with PolitiFact, which is one of those fact-checking organizations. And that's the one I would sort of walk you through a little bit. But I also want to point out that there are multiple brochures that have been put together for different age groups, for different susceptible age groups, whether it's for seniors or youth, which might have some difficulties with understanding either the historical and cultural concept, or might have technological difficulties in case of seniors, or not just being accustomed. There are also other efforts at the university level. So Harvard University, you can see on the right-hand side, there is gray iconographic ways to spot. So if you look at the left-hand side for the IFLA, how to stop fake news, they're still using the term fake news because at the time that wasn't really hijacked yet by politicians. But the important steps are laid out here very nicely. And I would basically say, if you could walk your elderly relatives or your young children, or if you could keep it in front of your computer to think in terms of several things. First of all, where are you when you land on a website, when you see it, a post on your social media news? Consider the source. Where is it coming from? That's something that intelligence officers or counterintelligence officers call situational awareness. Where are you? Fact checkers also look to see what is the source, where is it coming from, what are their sort of motivations behind what they're sharing. Once you get there, you can also look and see who the author is, more specifically. Do a quick search on the author. Is it an expert we're talking about, or is it somebody who is motivated by financial gains? You can also check the date. A lot of the times, legends and urban legends and rumors come back at us while the fires have been put out a long time ago. For instance, I heard from my teen son lately that Michael Jackson apparently isn't dead. And that's quite old news, but it keeps coming back at us. I know, I was surprised.
Wow.
But some of these, some of these things are amazing. How you could put a spin on information. So you should always check the biases and consider what is at heart of the people that are spreading the news. For instance, in Canada, as of about a week or two ago, in April, 12 to 16-year-olds were allowed to get vaccinated against COVID. And there were rumors going around that Canadian government is bribing children with ice cream. And that was grossly misrepresented. As a matter of fact, what happened is that in some lines where children were waiting under the sun, in heat, waiting for their turn, nicely social distance from other people in line, people came around offering them ice cream if they wanted it. So there was no bribing, but you can put a spin and you can frame it in very different terms. So I've just finished the left-hand side column. The right-hand side column comes back to some more media literacy. Are you reading beyond the headlines? I will talk a little bit later, if you'd like, about our reading habits. It comes back to how quickly we move on to the next bit of information. Are there any supporting sources that can provide additional evidence? Another important part is it's just a joke. Are you not getting the joke? Do you have the cultural, does it make sense to you? If something sounds off, for instance, if somebody tells you to put a tinfoil mask on your face because CDC has provided, or I don't know who, the World Health Organization now thinks that's the best way to protect yourself from the viruses, you should basically, consider the possibility of it being a prank. And then if you're in doubt, you should always ask the experts. The bottom line here is that you always have to stop and think. Do we always have the time and energy to do it? It's a different matter. And one of the figures that I have in the middle of that slide is that these simple interventions, they seem so simple, so intuitive, but do we do them? Well, researchers have found when they do them, and that's a study that was conducted across two contexts in the US and in India. They found that a simple exposure to helping, I think they were seniors, if I'm not mistaken, identify mis and disinformation was increasing their rate of being able to tell what is false news, what is a falsehood, by quite large numbers. So 26.5 in US and 17 in India. And I think the difference accounts for the levels of education. So that's my long answer to your question in terms of how to spot. And I hope it helps if you were to keep these iconographics sort of in mind.
Absolutely. I already learned something. But I've noticed, at least in my own social media scrolling, that a lot of this blatantly obvious fake news, and granted, I'm not the best. I could be better, as most of us probably could be. I've noticed a lot of it invokes an emotional reaction. We all could. I've noticed an emotional reaction is the goal.
A lot of the,
excuse me.
Yeah, well, that comes back, it comes back to the idea of using sensationalism and slightly fabricated or very fabricated news to get to people's emotions. And we're all used to fuzzy kittens and pigs swimming in pink beaches of Dominica, but other than that, there's also stronger emotions that are negative emotions, such as scorn or anger. And apparently we're very, we fall prey to these emotional manipulations quite easily.
Absolutely. Well, it's hard to separate the facts from the emotions, especially if you have some sort of emotions invested in whatever topic you happen to come across. I imagine it must be very difficult to scroll past something that's provocative in one way or another. So is that one of the ways that it's aimed to spread, is an emotional reaction, or what sort of tactics are used to spread mis and disinformation?
I think the tactics has to do with the model that underlies our user engagement. And it comes back to the idea that we react to emotions. We could show our likes and dislikes, or at least we'll view it and we can even reshare. And emotions sell. And a lot of the times people think of big giant tech as media companies, technology companies, perhaps, I don't know, what would you normally say? Google is search company, right? If you think about it, they're actually advertising companies. The model that underlies a lot of their operations is ad revenue, and they generate revenue by exposing them. Basically, it's an attention economy. They are buying your attention, they are buying your eyeballs, and the longer they can keep your eyeballs on the screen, the more ads they can show you, the more clicks. There's different models: pay per click, pay per view, pay per revenue. It all comes back to manipulating your attention, and it has gotten to the point that it's subtle manipulations with extensive surveillance, because we're all eagerly volunteering our information. So they basically, by looking at what we've reacted to, know what our triggers are. So they can show us more content that we like, more content that we hate. And that brings us back, and we're somewhat neurotically checking every day different media tweets to see what it is that we have been notified about. So we've been essentially primed like Pavlovian experiments. Wherever there is a ding, we go to see what else is there that's yummy for us. And then endorphins come into play, and it gives us a bit of a immediate gratification. But underlying principle is the more they can keep us on the online with engagement, the user engagement is the sort of the tactics of selling advertising.
So
At
nothing.
least that's my take of
Yeah,
it.
of course, I couldn't disagree. It sounds like nothing comes for free in this world anymore.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, who would you say is responsible then for stopping the spread of mis or disinformation? Is it on us, the users of social media, to recognize and stop? Or is it on the social media companies or media companies to fact check, warn, or even remove some of this mis and disinformation?
I think that I've been asking that question, not as much in terms of who's responsible. Well, yes, who's responsible for what has happened, and who's to blame for what has happened. I've come across a model from epidemic, famous model of disease triangle, in which basically, and it's a model that's used in medicine quite a bit too, and it's known to most doctors that disease wouldn't spread unless there are three causal factors, and we're talking about the host. The host has to be susceptible, compromised in some way. We're talking about the pathogen. In medicine, it might be a virus, a bacteria, and we're talking about the environment. The environment, and the contact has to happen, and the environment has to be conducive. So I thought about that, and I very much liked it in terms of not much the blaming game, but trying to understand who is responsible and what are the causal factors of what's happening. And that's how the triangle model that you have in the slide. I'd like to talk a little bit about those three corners or three episodes of the mis and disinformation triangle. So if you look at the top and sort of following that biological model, some digital media users are more susceptible to mis and disinformation than others. We are more susceptible sometimes to misunderstandings, hasty judgments. We're often overloaded with information. We're pressed for time. I mean, if anybody were to get through their, news feed, they couldn't really be spending and verifying every single fact, right? So there are some biases, some tendencies in how we interact with information, and some cognitive limitations. So that's one important factor, is that users have lacks certain ability or lacks certain time and effort to actually verify the information. So they have become susceptible. If you look on the left-hand side of the corner, we're talking about the pathogen, and it's a metaphoric expression for basically various kinds of fakes. We talked about clickbait, satire. We talked about intentional disinformation, where spin is put in or it's distorted. So basically newly generated or regurgitated messages that convey that deceptive, inaccurate, or misleading information that circulate very aggressively with the ad revenue model underneath it, sort of agitating it. So that's the second corner of it. And on the right-hand side, what we have is these conducive environments, again, following the model of biology, that if the contact were not to happen and the environment were not conducive, as we now all know with COVID, we know it spread through air. So that is the kind of conducive environment, literally. But in terms of fakes, we have these poorly regulated environments of social media platforms, which are very much responsible, in part, if not majorly responsible. If you don't want to, call the blaming game, at least they're complacent for allowing fakes to reach their susceptible users. So the promotional content at the heart of the ad revenue model is very meagerly vetted for its veracity, for its truth, and the digital content moderation and some efforts of sporadic labor to be more regulated. So you can see these three corners. And then when you ask me, how do we fix it? I think this three different types of measures have to be applied simultaneously. So if we look at the top again, what do we do with users that are prone to receiving disinformation or passing on misinformation? They need a lot of education, they need a lot of talking, they need a lot of exposure. So efforts in literacy. What do we do about the pathogen that's so virulent? Well, we need to detect them, whether it takes a human eye or AI, artificial intelligence. That's what my lab is working on. And in terms of environments that are so unregulated and so prone to this propagation of the content, they need stringent regulation. They can't police themselves because that would cut their own revenue stream, right? So there has to be grassroots efforts. There has to be regulation at the government levels. There has to be a global regulation. How come one person in charge of one huge company can tell when a former president of US can no longer speak via his environment? I mean, I'm not criticizing that decision. I think it should have been long coming, but still, they have to have better system for creating laws and rules that do not disadvantage other businesses that are, in terms of providing good information, thorough reporting, such as newsrooms, news reporting. They should be promoted. And there has to be a lot more effort in terms of regulating social media platforms and news media as well. So these are sort of my thoughts in terms of how it happened and who is to blame and what are we to do. So we are to educate, we are to detect, and we are to regulate.
So it's kind of a three-pronged approach to success here.
Yes, it's one of the three major efforts that have to happen. And I'm sure many people would argue there are other offshoots of that or some intermediaries or some combinations. But the point is that if we go at it from three different directions, there is already a better chance of succeeding. I don't know in terms of eliminating, but at least, combating the information and not making such a huge impact on our individual decisions for our everyday lives, whether it's elections or it's health decisions, because it's kind of disheartening to see what's happening sometimes, right?
Absolutely. But I think there is some good in this. I think as many people are aware now of what's going on in media and social media, and this weaponizing of fake news has kind of had a reverse effect where now everyone is aware, at least. And if someone's aware, then maybe they can make the effort to try and mitigate with themselves and maybe their group on social media or elsewhere. So small grassroots, but moving.
Right. And bigger sort of oversight at the bigger governmental levels as well.
And I think as we move into this new era of digitization and social media is everywhere, I think more and more people are aware of what's going on now. So we can at least work to prevent the spread or do something about it, I think.
Yeah, you're very right. And the polls actually confirm in the North American context, US, Canada, Mexico, I think at least 4 out of 5 people that are polled regularly would say that they encounter misinformation. They would also say it's a major concern for them.
Absolutely. I think it's something we all need to be aware of and stopping, because it causes more damage than I think people realize in discourse and politics and just everyday life.
And I think it's important not to actually leave it on the shoulders of individual users. There have to be tools And natural language processing is well positioned to come up with tools that actually allow us to bring up alerts, to bring up reminders to people that this is potentially misinformation or disinformation, and then they can decide in their own mind, and they can, sort of the idea of the green light, red light, stop, or yellow, orange light, stop and think again, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. So on that note, one last question I have is what is the role of AI moving forward and maybe fact checking or regulating? Because AI and algorithms are some of the reasons why ad based and uh, even hate or like based ads are on social media and media. So is there a flip side to this where AI can now debunk and maybe fact check?
Yes, so there are some efforts in automated fact checking. It's a complex process of doing it. What people have been fairly successful with is identifying different types of more formulaic misinformation, disinformation. For instance, clickbait, those catchy headlines like the best 10 thing you'll ever do in your life, or very vague but very curiosity based type of headlines and links, they can be identified by AI with about 92% accuracy. And I'm talking from
Wow.
experience because we do have a news verification browser, which is available for download through GitHub. It's an open source software, and it's one of the grassroots efforts coming out of academia. This is a program that was developed with my graduate students at the Literal Lab. So being able to pinpoint what it is that we're looking for, looking at two instances of reporting that is thorough and proper, and reporting that is attention-based clickbait,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing the differences lets us see the patterns that people use. Let us see these formulas that surprisingly still work on us. Because if you're vague enough and you say, he must have done it, you really want to know who he is, or she must have been there. You can't help but click. So this is like kind of the psychology of clickbait. But with NLP, natural language processing systems, as I said earlier, these algorithms that kind of mimic human understanding of what the difference is between clickbait and non-clickbait, we can get really good results. And we're kind of going down these various types that are clearly identified. The same thing for satire. Satire is a tricky issue because it does have a social purpose. We don't just make fun of people with satire. It's supposed to cure the social folly. It points out something witty, something that everybody sees and can win a prize for funny but true,
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you're lacking cultural context, or if you're lacking historical context, and you basically miss the mark and you think it's true and you promote it further as truism, then it becomes misinformation and still has the same impact of disinforming people. So satire is a little bit different from clickbait, and its success rate with natural language processing and machine learning, which is AI technologies for detection, is about 80%. So 8 out of 10 you can get with satire correctly. And again, it's based on evidence of collecting satire and not on the same topics, and seeing what's different about these kind of how we say things, when we say things, the onion and the lampoons of various kinds. But then there is the harder part, the actual falsehoods. So the fraudsters, the fraudulent reporting, the misrepresentation. And that's where the technology of lie detection comes to mind. And that's where psychology helps us. So there is a long-standing research in interpersonal psychology that says that the speech of truth tellers is slightly different from the speech of liars. And
Wow.
we're not very good at picking on it as human beings. We only have about 5 or 6 chances out of 10 that we're correct. So the average accuracy over 1,000 participants, over hundreds of experiments in the last 50 years of psychological research tell us that we're only 54% accurate. Can you imagine that? Everybody thinks they know when the Pinocchio nose is growing. We don't. We just basically don't have a chance. The chance improves though if we were to use these patterns and algorithmic processing, if we were to see systematically, for instance, one of the big markers is how often deceivers use the term I and we. The psychology behind it is if when you're lying, you want to distance yourself from what you're saying, and you can't control your pronouns, I, we, she, he, but you tend to say more often she or the person or everyone. You don't use I as often. And it's not a sure marker, but it's one of many that we're using in lie detection technology that's now automated AI based. And it's not, again, that, if somebody says, I did not have a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. I mean, it's still the use of an I, but on average, you can see when a person is saying more I's, he's likely or she is likely to be more truthful. So that's the kind of technology that we're working on, and that's nascent, but is already well explored in my community of natural language processing, machine learning, and AI. And the success rate there is about 6 or 7. It's not out of 10, so 65% accuracy. It's not the kind of success rate you would want to boast in normal technology. If you think about Google Translate or Alexa, everybody gets annoyed when there is a high error rate. But in case of such a infodemic or spread of mis and disinformation, it is useful to some extent to look into these kind of technologies that can give us a window, a glimpse at what could be misleading, inaccurate, or plainly false, as in lying.
I see what you mean. So it sounds like as we move forward, that technology may become a bigger and bigger tool for us to use to either spot or debunk or even prevent from even spreading misinformation and disinformation, this AI kind of automation tools.
Quite possibly, even though there is a debate, even email spam filters nowadays is still debated by some. You constantly fish out something you didn't mean to have been caught there. So there's an issue of having the capability to do it, and then how do you actually present it to the public? How do they use it? How do they adopt it? How often does it create conflict, and how people agree or disagree with the machine-based decisions? It's a tricky issue, but it starts from developing the science of being able to do it.
Wow. Well, I appreciate your time today. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers have too. One last thing, how can people get in contact with you or follow your work or find you on social media?
I'm on various social media, starting from Twitter under Victoria Rubin, Rubin. I have an email. Feel free to write to me. Tous les francophones au Canada, en Afrique, en France. Соотечественники, по-русски, пожалуйста. So I speak several languages. Feel free to write to me. I'm aware I'm speaking to European audience, potentially. So the lab is at the University of Western Ontario. And you can actually see a 3-minute demonstration of our news verification browser following that victoriarubin.films, Faculty of Information Media Studies at UWO, University of Western Ontario, Canada. And you can actually see the picture and read a little bit about my graduate students that have been active collaborators on most of my projects, whether managing data, coming up with neat programming tricks or algorithms of figuring out patterns, or even working on the psychological behavioral communication patterns of humans that fall prey to mis and disinformation. So all of the information is here.
Absolutely. Fighting the good fight, in my opinion.
Oh, good.
All right. Okay. I want to just thank you again for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our audience did as well. So
thank
again,
you, Olivia. Thank you to you for organizing this. It's a pleasure to spread the good word, and we hope to make progress in this fight.
And for any viewers that came in during the middle of our session today, we will have the full recording up on our YouTube channel. So be sure to like and subscribe on the Youth Time International Movement YouTube channel. And we will see you all soon, hopefully. All right. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.